In a mansion filled with luxury, one boy ate like a king, while another survived on scraps. The wealthy woman believed the orphan would never succeed in life. But years later, her empire crashed and poverty knocked on her door. Then the orphan she once mistreated walked back into her life, powerful enough to change her destiny. Before you proceed, do well to hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories like this. Let's go. The Whitmore Mansion stood proudly on a quiet hill in Greenwich, Connecticut, its tall white pillars glowing under the soft golden lights of evening. Inside, laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the grand hall. Expensive perfume floated through the air, mixing with the rich scent of roasted meat and freshly baked bread. Margaret Whitmore loved nights like this. She stood near the center of the room in a sleek emerald gown, greeting wealthy guests with a practiced smile. Cameras flashed occasionally as journalists documented the event. Tonight's dinner had a purpose. At least, that was what the banners said. Whitmore Foundation Charity Gala, supporting orphan children across America. Margaret lifted her glass gracefully and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said warmly, "tonight we gather not only as successful individuals, but as compassionate ones. Every child deserves an opportunity." The guests applauded. Across the room, her 12-year-old son Daniel leaned against a marble pillar scrolling through his phone, clearly bored. He had inherited his mother's sharp features and confident posture, but unlike Margaret, he had never learned to pretend he cared. After the applause died down, a middle-aged woman approached Margaret. She wore a modest gray suit and carried a folder under her arm. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said politely, "thank you again for supporting our orphanage." Margaret nodded politely. "This is Ms. Rodriguez," she told the nearby guests, "Director of Brookside Children's Home." Ms. Rodriguez smiled gratefully. "We actually brought one of the children tonight," she said. "A very special boy." Margaret's smile stiffened slightly. She hadn't expected that. Ms. Rodriguez turned toward the entrance and gestured. "Come in, Austin." A small boy slowly stepped inside the grand hall. He looked out of place immediately. While everyone else wore elegant suits and dresses, the boy stood in faded jeans and a simple blue shirt that looked slightly too big for him. His dark hair fell unevenly over his forehead, and his thin arms hung nervously at his sides. His name was Austin Gilmore, and he was 10 years old. The room grew quiet as curious eyes turned toward him. Austin had never seen anything like the Whitmore Mansion. The glittering chandeliers above him looked like clusters of frozen stars. The polished marble floor reflected the lights, so brightly he felt as though he might slip if he walked too quickly. He kept his eyes down. Ms. Rodriguez spoke gently. "Austin is one of our brightest children," she said. "He loves reading and mathematics." Austin shifted awkwardly, unsure where to look. Margaret studied him for a moment. Cameras were still present. Guests were watching. She understood the opportunity immediately. A wealthy philanthropist helping an orphan. Perfect publicity. "How wonderful," Margaret said warmly, placing a gentle hand on Austin's shoulder. The boy flinched slightly, surprised by the sudden contact. "How would you like to stay with us for a while, Austin?" Margaret asked sweetly. "Our home has plenty of space." Austin's eyes widened. Ms. Rodriguez looked pleasantly surprised. "That would be incredibly generous, Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret smiled graciously as another camera flashed. "Yes," she said. "We must all do our part." Across the room, Daniel rolled his eyes. Austin arrived at the Whitmore Mansion 2 days later with a single worn suitcase. The house looked even bigger during daylight. A tall iron gate guarded the long driveway. Perfectly trimmed hedges lined the path, and a fountain sprayed water high into the air at the center of the circular courtyard. Austin stepped out of the car slowly, staring up at the enormous building. It looked more like a palace than a house. Margaret greeted him at the door. "Welcome," she said briskly. Her warm smile from the charity dinner was gone. Inside, the house felt colder than Austin expected. White marble floors stretched through endless hallways. Expensive paintings hung on the walls. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish. A housekeeper named Clara led Austin upstairs. "You'll sleep here," she said, opening a narrow door. The room was small. It looked like a storage room that had been hastily cleared. A narrow bed sat against the wall beside a small desk. But to Austin, it was still better than many rooms at the orphanage. He smiled quietly. "Thank you." Clara gave him a sympathetic look, but said nothing. Downstairs, Daniel watched Austin carry his suitcase through the hallway. "That's the orphan?" he asked his mother. Margaret nodded. "He'll only be here temporarily." Daniel smirked. "Good." The first few days passed quietly. Austin tried to stay out of everyone's way. He woke early, made his bed neatly, and ate breakfast silently at the corner of the large kitchen table. At first, Margaret treated him politely in front of guests. But when they were alone, her tone changed. "You should help around the house," she said one afternoon. "Since you're staying here." Austin nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." Soon his daily routine became clear. He washed dishes after every meal. He cleaned the dining room table. He vacuumed long hallways. Meanwhile, Daniel spent his afternoons playing video games or meeting friends. Dinner time made the difference between them painfully obvious. One evening, Margaret served Daniel a perfectly grilled steak with roasted vegetables and mashed potatoes. Austin waited quietly at the far end of the table. When Daniel finished eating, Margaret stood and gathered the plates. She placed Daniel's half-eaten food onto a smaller plate and slid it toward Austin. "There," she said. "Don't waste food." Austin looked at the plate. Cold steak scraps. A few pieces of carrot. He nodded silently. "Thank you." Daniel laughed. "Look at him," he said mockingly. "Like a stray dog." Margaret didn't correct him. Weeks passed. Austin worked quietly every day. Despite the long chores, he still attended the local school. But exhaustion made it difficult to concentrate. Sometimes he fell asleep over his homework. One evening, after cleaning the kitchen, Austin noticed something unusual. A book lay on the counter beside the trash bin. Its cover was torn, and several pages were bent. He picked it up carefully. It was a mathematics textbook. Austin's eyes lit up. He had always loved numbers. At the orphanage, books were limited, and older children often took the best ones first. He carried the book quietly to his small room. That night he opened it under the dim lamp and began reading. Numbers filled the pages. Equations. Problems. Puzzles. Austin solved them eagerly, writing answers on scraps of paper he found in the desk drawer. For the first time since arriving at the Whitmore house, he smiled. At school, however, things were different. Many students knew he lived with the Whitmores. Some whispered. Some laughed. Daniel often made things worse. "Hey everyone," he told his friends one afternoon in the hallway. "That's the orphan my mom adopted for charity points." Austin kept walking without responding. But one teacher noticed something unusual. Mr. Harrison Grant had taught mathematics for over 30 years. He had learned to recognize talent. One afternoon, he wrote a complex problem on the board. Most students stared at it helplessly. Austin studied it quietly. Then he raised his hand. Mr. Grant looked surprised. "Yes, Austin?" Austin walked to the board and solved the equation in seconds. The classroom fell silent. Mr. Grant stared at the solution. It was correct. Not only correct. Elegant. After class, Mr. Grant stopped him at the door. "Austin," he said gently, "where did you learn that?" Austin shrugged shyly. "I just like numbers." Mr. Grant smiled. Something about the boy reminded him of himself years ago. "Would you like some extra books?" he asked. Austin's eyes brightened immediately. "Yes, sir." From that day on, Austin stayed after school twice a week. Mr. Grant gave him more challenging problems. Austin solved them all. But one night Margaret discovered something she didn't like. She walked past Austin's room and noticed the light still on. Inside, Austin sat at the desk solving equations. "What are you doing?" Margaret demanded sharply. Austin jumped. I'm studying." Margaret picked up the math book and frowned. "You should be sleeping. You have chores in the morning." "Yes, ma'am." She flipped through the pages dismissively. "Education is wasted on people who won't use it," she said coldly. Austin lowered his eyes. She leaned closer. No orphan becomes successful, she said quietly. Know your place. She placed the book back on the desk and left. Austin sat silently for a long moment. Then he opened the book again. Months later, Mr. Grant made an important announcement in class. The National Academic Excellence Scholarship Exam will take place next month, he said. It offers full scholarships to some of the best private schools in the country. Students murmured excitedly. After class, Mr. Grant called Austin aside. I registered you, he said. Austin blinked in surprise. Me? Yes, Mr. Grant said firmly. You deserve the opportunity. Austin studied harder than ever. Late at night, after finishing chores, he solved problems under the dim lamp. Some nights he barely slept. Finally, exam day arrived. Austin traveled to the testing center with dozens of other students. The questions were difficult, but to him, they felt like puzzles waiting to be solved. Weeks later, the results arrived. Mr. Grant opened the letter slowly. His hands trembled slightly. Then he smiled. Austin, he said quietly, you did it. Austin stared at him. You scored one of the highest marks in the entire state. Austin couldn't breathe. You've won a full scholarship to St. Mark's Academy, one of the most prestigious schools in the country. That evening, Austin stood nervously in Margaret's office. She read the letter without expression. So, she said finally, you're leaving. Austin nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. Margaret handed the letter back. Good, she said coldly. That means you won't be a burden here anymore. Austin swallowed quietly. The next morning, he packed his small suitcase. Clara hugged him gently before he left. You'll do great things, she whispered. Austin stepped outside the mansion. For the first time since arriving, he didn't feel small. He looked back at the enormous house one last time. Then he walked toward the waiting car, toward a future no one in that house believed he could have. But the boy who once ate scraps was about to begin a journey that would change everything. The iron gates of St. Mark's Academy slowly opened as the black sedan rolled forward. Austin Gilmore pressed his forehead gently against the window, staring at the enormous campus stretching before him. Green lawns spread across rolling hills. Tall oak trees lined the wide stone pathways, and elegant brick buildings stood proudly under the autumn sky. Students walked in small groups, laughing and talking, their uniforms neat and expensive. Everything about the place felt different from anywhere Austin had ever been. He tightened his grip on the small suitcase resting beside him. This was his new world, but he wasn't sure if he belonged in it. The car stopped in front of the main building. A tall woman with silver glasses and a welcoming smile waited at the entrance. Welcome to St. Mark's, she said warmly. You must be Austin Gilmore. Austin stepped out nervously. Yes, ma'am. I'm Headmistress Palmer, she said. We've been expecting you. She glanced at the letter in her hand. Your exam scores were remarkable. Austin looked down shyly. Thank you. As they walked across the courtyard, Austin noticed the other students glancing at him. Most of them arrived in luxury cars driven by chauffeurs. Their parents wore expensive suits and dresses. Austin carried only one worn suitcase. A few whispers followed him. Scholarship kid. Probably from some poor school. Austin pretended not to hear. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best response. The first weeks were difficult. The classes were far more challenging than his old school. Students competed fiercely. Many of them had private tutors since childhood. But Austin had something many of them did not. Hunger. Not the kind that came from missing meals, though he had known that too. His hunger came from years of being told he would never succeed. Every night he studied harder than anyone else. While other students relaxed in the dormitories, Austin sat at his desk solving equations and reading textbooks late into the night. His favorite subjects quickly became mathematics and computer science. Numbers felt predictable. They didn't judge him. They didn't laugh. They simply waited to be solved. Within months, teachers began noticing him. One afternoon in the advanced mathematics class, Professor Leonard stopped mid-lecture. He stared at the complex equation written on the board. Interesting, he murmured. Then he turned to the class. Who can solve this? No one raised their hand. Except Austin. The professor raised an eyebrow. Yes, Mr. Gilmore? Austin walked to the board calmly. He solved the problem in under a minute. When he stepped back, the room remained silent. Professor Leonard adjusted his glasses. Well, he said slowly, that is correct. A few students exchanged surprised looks. From that moment on, Austin Gilmore was no longer invisible. Years passed quickly. Austin became one of the top students at St. Mark's. He won national academic competitions. He earned recognition in mathematics Olympiads. And by the time he graduated, universities across the country were competing to offer him scholarships. One name stood out above the rest. Columbia University, located in New York City, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. Austin accepted the offer. When he arrived in Manhattan for the first time, he felt the same mixture of excitement and uncertainty he had felt years earlier at St. Mark's. Towering skyscrapers stretched toward the clouds. Yellow taxis rushed through busy streets. The city never seemed to sleep. But Austin thrived there. At Columbia, he chose to study computer engineering and business management. The combination fascinated him. Technology could solve problems that traditional businesses could not. Austin spent countless hours in computer labs designing software programs. One project in particular captured his attention. Supply chains, the systems that moved goods from manufacturers to stores across the country. They were complex, inefficient, and often outdated. Austin believed technology could improve them. By his third year in college, he had begun building a software platform designed to optimize distribution networks. The system analyzed thousands of variables: transportation costs, warehouse locations, delivery times, demand predictions. His algorithm could reduce operational costs by nearly 30%. At first, it was just a university project. But then something unexpected happened. One of his professors forwarded the program to a technology conference. Within weeks, executives from major companies began contacting him. One company in particular showed serious interest. Titan Logix Technologies, one of the highest-paying and fastest-growing tech companies in the United States. They invited Austin to present his system. He flew to California for the meeting. The executives sat around a long glass table while Austin demonstrated his software. Graphs appeared on the screen showing dramatic efficiency improvements. When he finished, the room was silent. Then the CEO leaned forward slowly. "How old are you?" he asked. 23, Austin replied. The CEO smiled. "Mr. Gilmore, how would you like a job?" Austin left the meeting with something he had never imagined as a child. A six-figure salary, stock options, and a leadership role developing supply chain technology for global corporations. The boy who once ate scraps in a quiet kitchen had just entered the world of the most powerful business leaders in America. While Austin's life moved upward, far away in Connecticut, another life was beginning to crumble. Margaret Whitmore still ran her food distribution company. At least she tried to. But the industry had changed. New technologies were transforming logistics and transportation. Margaret's company relied on outdated systems. Deliveries were slow. Costs were rising. Competition was fierce. Her advisors recommended modernizing the company. But Margaret refused. "We've done things this way for 20 years, she said stubbornly during a board meeting. "Why change now?" The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Meanwhile, Daniel Whitmore had grown into adulthood without developing much responsibility. He drove expensive cars. He spent money on parties and vacations. Whenever Margaret suggested he learn the business, he dismissed the idea. "Relax, Mom," he said one afternoon while scrolling through luxury watches online. "You're rich. We're fine." But the numbers told a different story. The company began losing major clients. Several contracts were canceled. And new competitors entered the market with advanced technology that delivered goods faster and cheaper. Margaret blamed everyone except herself. The economy, the employees, even the clients. But the truth was simple. Her business model was becoming obsolete. 5 years later, Austin Gilmore had risen quickly within Titan Logics. His supply chain platform had transformed multiple industries. Retail companies used it. Manufacturers used it. Transportation networks used it. His system helped businesses save millions of dollars. Eventually, Austin became one of the youngest senior executives in the company. His work earned him respect across the tech world. Yet despite his success, he remained humble. He still lived simply. He still worked long hours. And he never forgot the quiet kitchen where he once ate leftovers alone. Back in Connecticut, Margaret Whitmore faced the worst crisis of her career. Her company had accumulated enormous debts. Several investors withdrew their support. A lawsuit over delayed shipments cost the company millions. One afternoon, Margaret sat at the long conference table in her office as her financial advisor delivered devastating news. "There's no way to recover from this," he said quietly. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he replied gently, "the company is bankrupt." The word echoed in the room like a gunshot. Bankrupt. Margaret felt the ground beneath her future collapse. Within months, everything unraveled. Banks seized company assets. The Whitmore mansion was sold. Luxury cars were repossessed. Daniel's expensive lifestyle suddenly ended. Debt collectors began calling daily. Friends who once admired the Whitmores slowly disappeared. Margaret moved into a small apartment in a quiet town. The woman who once hosted lavish charity galas now struggled to pay basic bills. Daniel grew bitter and restless. "You ruined everything," he told his mother one night. Margaret said nothing. For the first time in her life, she had no answer. One rainy evening, Margaret sat alone in her dim apartment. Outside, water tapped softly against the windows. She opened an old storage box filled with photographs from better years. Images of parties, business events, family holidays. Then one photo caught her attention. A charity dinner. Guests smiling at the camera. And standing awkwardly beside her, a thin boy with messy hair. Austin Gilmore. Margaret stared at the picture for a long time. She remembered the boy eating quietly at the kitchen table. The scraps she gave him. The cold words she spoke. A strange feeling stirred in her chest. Regret. She whispered softly to herself. Maybe. I was too harsh. But she quickly dismissed the thought. In her mind, Austin was probably struggling somewhere. After all, he had been just an orphan. Life rarely rewarded people like that. Hundreds of miles away, in a sleek glass office in New York City, Austin Gilmore sat at a conference table reviewing business reports. The meeting was routine. Financial summaries, acquisition opportunities, corporate strategies. Then one document caught his attention. A bankruptcy report. He scanned the page quickly, and suddenly froze. A familiar company name appeared in bold letters. Whitmore Food Distribution. For a moment, the room around him seemed to fade. Memories rushed back. The mansion, the kitchen, the scraps, Daniel's laughter, Margaret's cold voice. One of the executives noticed his expression. "Austin," she asked. "You okay?" Austin slowly placed the document on the table. Then he asked a quiet question that surprised everyone in the room. What happened to Margaret Whitmore? No one in the meeting realized it yet. But the fate of a fallen family and a forgotten orphan was about to collide again. And when it did, everything would change. The conference room at Titan Logics fell silent after Austin Gilmore asked the question. What happened to Margaret Whitmore? The executives exchanged puzzled glances. Most of them had never heard the name before. Finally, the company's financial analyst adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the bankruptcy report again. "Well," he said slowly, "Whitmore Food Distribution collapsed about 2 years ago." Austin listened carefully. Apparently, they lost several major contracts. Their delivery system couldn't compete with newer logistics technologies. Austin knew exactly what those technologies were. His own. The analyst continued. The company declared bankruptcy. Most of their assets were seized by creditors. The owner, Margaret Whitmore, disappeared from the business scene shortly afterward. Austin's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. "Do we know where she is now?" he asked. The analyst shook his head. "Not exactly. But I could probably find out." Austin nodded quietly. "Please do." The meeting continued, but Austin barely heard the rest of the conversation. His mind had already traveled years into the past. He remembered the large kitchen at the Whitmore mansion, the cold leftovers on a small plate, Daniel's mocking laughter, Margaret's voice telling him he would never succeed. Yet now their roles had changed completely, and Austin wasn't sure how he felt about it. 2 days later, the analyst returned with new information. "She's living in a small town in upstate New York," he reported. "A place called Millbrook." Austin leaned forward slightly. "What does she do?" The analyst hesitated. "She works as a cashier at a grocery store." The room grew quiet. The once powerful businesswoman had fallen far. Austin sat back in his chair slowly. Images of Margaret Whitmore in elegant gowns hosting glamorous parties clashed with the picture of her standing behind a small grocery counter. It felt almost unreal. His colleague Olivia Carter noticed his expression. She had worked with Austin for several years and respected him deeply. "You knew her?" she asked gently. Austin looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline. "Yes," he said quietly. "She was part of my childhood." Olivia waited. Austin rarely spoke about his past. After a moment, he continued. "I lived in her house for a while when I was 10. Olivia smiled slightly. "That must have been nice. A big mansion like that." Austin didn't smile. "It wasn't." Olivia's expression changed. "You mean?" Austin nodded slowly. "I was the orphan she took in for publicity." The words hung in the air. Olivia leaned back in her chair, surprised. "And now you're the executive whose technology replaced her company." Austin gave a small nod. Life has a strange sense of humor. Olivia studied him carefully. "So what are you going to do?" Austin didn't answer immediately. The truth was he didn't know. That night, Austin sat alone in his apartment overlooking the Hudson River. The city lights shimmered across the water. Normally the view calmed him, but tonight his thoughts were restless. He remembered the night Margaret discovered him studying. "No orphan becomes successful," she had said. For years those words had burned in his mind. They had pushed him forward, driven him to prove her wrong. And now he had. He had more success than she could have imagined. But strangely, victory didn't feel the way he expected. He could destroy what remained of her life if he wanted. He could humiliate her, remind her of every cruel word she had spoken. Yet another memory appeared in his mind. Mr. Harrison Grant, the teacher who had believed in him when no one else did. "If someone shows you kindness," Mr. Grant had once told him, "don't forget to pass it forward." Austin closed his eyes slowly. The decision forming in his mind surprised even him. 3 days later, Austin drove north from New York City. The sleek black car moved along a quiet highway surrounded by tall trees and open farmland. Millbrook was a small town. Nothing like Manhattan. The streets were peaceful. Local shops lined the sidewalks. Austin parked near a modest grocery store on the corner. The sign read, "Millbrook Fresh Market." He stepped inside. The store was simple. Rows of fresh produce. A few customers walking quietly through the aisles. At the far end, near the checkout counter, a woman scanned items slowly. Her hair was grayer now, her posture slightly bent. But Austin recognized her instantly. Margaret Whitmore. She looked older than he remembered. Life had clearly been hard on her. For a moment, Austin simply stood there watching. The woman who once controlled a powerful company now packed groceries into paper bags. A customer thanked her politely and walked away. Austin stepped forward. Margaret looked up. "Hello," she said automatically. "Did you find everything you needed?" Austin studied her face. She hadn't recognized him. "Almost," he said calmly. Something about his voice made her pause. She looked closer. Her eyes widened slowly. For a moment she said nothing. Then the scanner slipped from her hand and fell onto the counter. "Austin?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Yes," he replied gently. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. The The thin orphan boy she remembered had become a confident man in an elegant suit. "You," she struggled to speak. "I heard about your company," Austin said quietly. Margaret's face tightened with embarrassment. "Yes," she said softly. That didn't end well. Silence filled the space between them. Margaret braced herself for anger, for humiliation. After all, she had given him plenty of reasons. But Austin simply stood there calmly. Finally, she spoke again. "I suppose you came to see how far I've fallen." Austin shook his head. "No." Margaret looked confused. "Then why are you here?" Austin reached into his coat pocket and placed a folder on the counter. "I bought your company," he said. Margaret blinked. "What? Or what was left of it?" Austin explained. "The bankruptcy auction happened 6 months ago. My company acquired the remaining assets." Margaret stared at him in shock. "You own Whitmore Distribution now?" Austin nodded. "But it's not the same company anymore." Margaret looked down at the folder slowly. "Then why show me this?" Austin opened the folder and turned it toward her. Inside were documents, business plans, financial projections, and a new company name, Gilmore Logistics Group. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "What does this have to do with me?" Austin met her eyes calmly. "I want you to help run it." The words stunned her. "You what?" "You built the original company," Austin continued. "You understand the industry better than most people." Margaret shook her head slowly. "After everything I did to you, you want to give me a job?" Austin's voice remained steady. "Not a job. A partnership." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. "I don't deserve that." Austin was silent for a moment. Then he spoke gently. "When I was a child, someone believed in me when no one else did." He thought of Mr. Grant. "I decided that if I ever had the chance, I would give that opportunity to someone else." Margaret covered her mouth as tears began falling down her cheeks. "I treated you terribly," she whispered. Austin nodded slightly. "Yes. I fed my own son steaks and gave you scraps." Austin remembered those nights clearly. But instead of anger, he felt something unexpected. "Peace." "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. Margaret shook her head. "No, it wasn't." At that moment, the grocery store door opened. A man walked in hesitantly. Austin recognized him immediately. Daniel Whitmore. But he looked very different now. The arrogance was gone. His clothes were simple. His expression tired. He froze when he saw Austin standing there. "You," Daniel said quietly. Austin nodded. "Hello, Daniel." Daniel looked at his mother. "What's going on?" Margaret wiped her tears. "Austin came to help us." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you help us?" Austin looked at him calmly. "Because everyone deserves a second chance." Daniel lowered his head slowly. "I was horrible to you," he admitted. Austin gave a small smile. "You were a kid." "So were you," Daniel said quietly. The three of them stood in silence for a moment. Finally, Austin closed the folder and pushed it gently toward Margaret. "The company reopens next month," he said. "I'd like both of you there." Margaret looked at him with disbelief and gratitude. "You really mean this?" Austin nodded. "Yes." For the first time in many years, hope returned to Margaret Whitmore's life. 1 month later, a crowd gathered outside a newly renovated office building in New York. A large banner hung across the entrance. Gilmore Logistics Group, grand opening. Reporters stood nearby with cameras ready. Austin stepped onto the small stage set up in front of the building. Beside him stood Margaret Whitmore and Daniel. Margaret looked around the crowd in amazement. Just a month earlier, she had been scanning groceries. Now she stood beside the man she once treated like nothing. Austin began his speech. "Success isn't just about money or power," he said. "It's about the choices we make when life gives us the chance to help someone else." Margaret felt tears filling her eyes again. She looked at Austin with quiet gratitude. Years ago, she had given him scraps. Yet somehow he had grown into the man with the richest heart in the room. And in that moment, she understood something she had never truly known before. True wealth was never measured in money. It was measured in kindness. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe to Boundless Echoes for more interesting stories. We really appreciate your support. Comment where you are watching from, so we can give you a shout out. See you in our next video.